The first mortar round hit the eastern perimeter at 0347 hours, sending shockwaves through Forward Operating Base Sentinel that rattled windows and shook dust from every surface. Elena Martinez was already awake in the medical aid station, restocking supplies by the dim glow of emergency lighting when the explosion painted the night sky orange. She didn't flinch. After 8 months at this remote outpost in the mountains of Kandahar Province, she'd learned to distinguish between incoming fire and outgoing artillery before most soldiers even opened their eyes. What she couldn't have predicted was that before dawn broke over the jagged peaks surrounding their isolated base, she would single-handedly fight off 20 armed insurgents to protect 4 critically wounded soldiers, using nothing but medical supplies, improvised weapons, and a skill set that nobody at FOB Sentinel knew she possessed. Staff Sergeant Ryan Torres, who had spent months calling her just a medic and questioning whether she belonged anywhere near real combat, would watch in stunned silence as Elena Martinez demonstrated exactly what a real warrior looked like when everything was on the line. But that revelation was still hours away, hidden behind a series of events that would strip away every assumption, every prejudice, and every comfortable lie that the soldiers of Bravo Company had told themselves about the quiet medic who kept them alive. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain air at Forward Operating Base Sentinel carried the perpetual scent of diesel fuel, gun oil, and the peculiar metallic tang that came from living too close to danger for too long. Elena Martinez stepped out of the medical aid station into the pre-dawn darkness, her breath visible in the thin air as she made her way across the compound for her morning rounds. The base sat like a concrete and steel island in a sea of hostile territory, surrounded by observation towers that pierced the sky like steel fingers reaching toward stars that seemed close enough to touch in the rarefied atmosphere. The buildings were a mixture of permanent concrete structures and temporary facilities that had become permanent through the simple passage of time and the military's institutional resistance to change. The medical aid station where Elena spent most of her waking hours was one of the concrete buildings, a squat, functional structure that prioritized protection over comfort. Its walls were thick enough to stop small arms fire and most shrapnel, with narrow windows that offered limited views of the surrounding mountains but maximum protection from snipers who might be watching from the ridgelines. Elena's footsteps echoed off the concrete as she walked past the motor pool, where Specialist Tom Rodriguez was already working despite the early hour. Tom was one of the few soldiers on the base who treated Elena with genuine respect, though she suspected it had more to do with his naturally friendly personality than any real understanding of her capabilities. He looked up from the engine he was working on and raised a grease-stained hand in greeting. The mess hall was beginning to show signs of life as the cooks prepared for the morning meal service. Through the windows, Elena could see the familiar figures moving around in the kitchen, their routines as predictable as the sunrise that would soon paint the mountain peaks in shades of gold and crimson. The entire base operated on rhythms that had been established through months of repetition, each soldier finding their place in the complex machinery of military life. Elena's medical bag bounced against her hip as she walked, a constant reminder of her role in this isolated community. The bag contained the tools of her trade, basic medical supplies that she'd become expert at using in conditions that would challenge doctors in fully equipped hospitals. Bandages, pain medication, antibiotics, and the various instruments needed to keep soldiers alive long enough to get them to more advanced medical facilities. What the bag didn't contain, what nobody at FOB Sentinel knew about, were the memories of using far more sophisticated equipment in far more dangerous situations. The Eastern Perimeter Observation Post was her first stop, a routine check on Private First Class Alex Chun, who had been complaining of headaches for the past week. Shun was young, barely 20, with the kind of eager enthusiasm that hadn't yet been worn down by the grinding reality of deployment life. He was also one of the soldiers who seemed to take pleasure in questioning Elena's presence at the base, though his comments were usually delivered with a smile that was supposed to make them seem harmless. Elena climbed the wooden steps to the observation post, her boots making solid contact with each plank. The structure was elevated to provide clear sight lines across the valley, offering commanding views of the approaches that insurgents might use to attack the base. Chun was sitting behind the heavy machine gun mounted on the platform, scanning the pre-dawn landscape through night vision equipment that made everything appear in ghostly green shadows. The headaches turned out to be nothing more serious than dehydration and stress, common problems for soldiers who spent long hours in observation posts where the combination of altitude, dry air, and constant vigilance took its toll on the human body. Elena administered a mild pain reliever and reminded Chun about the importance of staying hydrated, advice that he received with the kind of nodding acknowledgement that suggested he was only half listening. Her next stop was the communications center, where Sergeant Maria Gonzalez was monitoring radio traffic from higher headquarters. Maria was one of the veteran medics on the base, a career soldier who had seen multiple deployments and understood the realities of military medicine in ways that textbooks could never teach. She was also one of the few people who sensed that there was more to Elena Martinez than her current assignment suggested, though she'd never pressed for details. The communications center hummed with electronic activity, banks of radio equipment, maintaining contact with scattered patrol bases and higher command elements. The constant chatter of military communications created a background noise that became as familiar as breathing for soldiers who worked in these facilities. Maria looked up from her equipment when Elena entered, her weathered face showing the kind of fatigue that came from too many hours of monitoring emergency frequencies. Elena's medical rounds continued through the base, a routine that had become second nature over the months of deployment. She checked on soldiers who were recovering from minor injuries, administered medications to those with ongoing conditions, and maintained the medical readiness that kept Bravo Company operational in an environment where the nearest hospital was a helicopter ride away. Each interaction followed patterns that had been established through repetition, professional conversations that rarely ventured into personal territory. The motor pool was bustling with activity when Elena made her way back through the compound. Tom Rodriguez had been joined by several other mechanics who were performing maintenance on the vehicles that kept the base supplied and connected to the outside world. The Humvees and trucks that served as the base's lifeline required constant attention in the harsh mountain environment, where dust, altitude, and rough terrain combined to create mechanical challenges that tested both equipment and the soldiers who maintained it. Elena paused near the motor pool, ostensibly to check on a mechanic who had injured his hand the previous day, but actually taking a moment to observe the controlled chaos of military maintenance operations. There was something about the systematic approach to problem solving that resonated with her, the way experienced mechanics could diagnose complex problems through a combination of technical knowledge and intuitive understanding developed through years of hands-on experience. Staff Sergeant Ryan Torres emerged from the command post as Elena was finishing her conversation with the injured mechanic. Torres was the kind of infantry soldier who wore his combat credentials like a badge of honor, a career warrior who had earned his rank through multiple deployments and the kind of leadership that inspired confidence in his subordinates. He was also the soldier who had made Elena's life at FOB Sentinel more difficult than it needed to be, though his opposition seemed to stem from institutional prejudice rather than personal animosity. Torres approached with the confident stride of someone who was completely comfortable in his environment, his uniform bearing the subtle signs of someone who understood military protocol while maintaining the practical modifications that marked experienced combat soldiers. His weapon was slung across his chest in a way that suggested easy familiarity, positioned for quick access while remaining secure during normal activities. The conversation that followed was typical of Elena's interactions with Torres, a professionally courteous exchange that barely concealed underlying tensions about roles, responsibilities, and the complex dynamics of a military unit operating in isolation. Torres inquired about the medical readiness of his soldiers and the kind of routine check that was part of his leadership responsibilities, but his questions carried undertones that suggested he viewed Elena's role as somehow secondary to the real work of soldiering. Elena provided the medical updates that Torres required, reporting on the minor injuries and illnesses that were part of any military unit's daily reality. Her responses were professional and complete, delivered in the kind of crisp military manner that left no room for criticism of her competence or dedication. What she didn't mention, what Torres had no reason to know, was that her medical training extended far beyond the basic combat medic skills that her current assignment required. The sun was beginning to rise over the eastern peaks when Elena returned to the medical aid station, painting the mountains in colors that made the harsh landscape appear almost beautiful. The morning light revealed details that were hidden in darkness, showing the full extent of the base's defensive positions and the challenging terrain that surrounded their isolated outpost. The beauty was deceptive, Elena knew, masking dangers that could emerge from any direction without warning. Inside the medical aid station, Elena began her daily inventory of supplies, checking equipment and medications with the systematic thoroughness that military medicine demanded. Every item had to be accounted for, every expiration date noted, every piece of equipment tested and ready for immediate use. The routine was both practical and meditative, providing a sense of order and control in an environment where chaos could erupt without warning. The medical aid station itself was a study in functional efficiency, designed to provide maximum medical capability within the constraints of size, weight, and protection requirements. The main treatment area contained examination tables, medical equipment, and supply storage arranged to allow rapid response to multiple casualties. A smaller area served as Elena's office and living space, providing the minimal privacy that military life allowed. What none of her colleagues knew, what Elena had never mentioned during her 8 months at FOB Sentinel, was that the combat medic training that qualified her for this assignment represented only a fraction of her actual medical capabilities. Before her current deployment, before the bureaucratic decisions that had led to her assignment as a basic combat medic, Elena Martinez had been Captain Elena Martinez, Special Forces Medical Sergeant with advanced trauma training in combat. Experience that exceeded most of the infantry soldiers who questioned her presence at the base. The transition from Special Forces medic to regular Army combat medic had been the result of a conflict with a superior officer who had disagreed with Elena's medical judgment during a previous deployment. The disagreement had centered on triage decisions during a mass casualty event, where Elena had prioritized treating wounded civilians over military personnel based on the severity of their injuries and the likelihood of survival. Her superior had viewed this as a failure to prioritize American forces, while Elena had seen it as the moral and medical obligation to save the lives that could be saved regardless of uniform. The administrative resolution of that conflict had been Elena's reassignment to a position that better matched her perceived judgment and priorities. The Special Forces medical training that had taken years to complete, the advanced skills that had saved countless lives in the most challenging combat environments had been relegated to a personnel file that followed her but was never consulted. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Elena had accepted the demotion without protest, understanding that fighting the system would only result in more severe consequences. Now, as she completed her morning inventory in the medical aid station at FOB Sentinel, Elena reflected on the irony of her situation. She was surrounded by soldiers who viewed her as barely qualified for basic medical support, while possessing training and experience that exceeded anyone else on the base. The Advanced Trauma Life Support Certification, the surgical training, the experience treating combat wounds under fire, all of it hidden beneath the simple designation of combat medic that defined her current role. The radio in the medical aid station crackled with routine communication traffic, the constant background noise of a military unit maintaining contact with higher command and scattered elements. Elena listened with half her attention while continuing. Her supply inventory, her trained ear automatically filtering the routine reports from anything that might indicate developing problems. The morning seemed to be progressing normally, with no indication of the chaos that would soon transform their isolated outpost into a battlefield. Elena's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Corporal Jake Mitchell, Torres' usual companion, and another soldier who seemed to enjoy questioning Elena's qualifications for her position. Mitchell entered the medical aid station with the casual confidence of someone who viewed the facility as support rather than combat capability, his attitude reflecting the common military prejudice that divided soldiers into warriors and support personnel. Mitchell's visit was ostensibly for a routine medical check, a minor issue with his knee that had been bothering him during long patrols. Elena conducted the examination with professional thoroughness, checking range of motion, testing for signs of serious injury, and recommending treatment that would address the problem without compromising Mitchell's ability to perform his duties. The interaction followed the same patterns as most of Elena's dealings with the infantry soldiers, professionally correct, but lacking the mutual respect that should exist between members of the same unit. What Mitchell didn't know, what none of the infantry soldiers understood, was that Elena had treated far more serious injuries under far more challenging conditions during her Special Forces deployments. The knee problem that brought him to the medical aid station was routine, compared to the complex trauma cases she had handled in forward operating bases, where she was the only medical personnel available for hundreds of miles. The surgical procedures she had performed using improvised equipment and limited supplies. The lives she had saved through a combination of advanced training and innovative problem-solving, all of it invisible to soldiers who saw only her current assignment. The morning progressed with the kind of routine activity that characterized life at an isolated military outpost. Elena completed her medical duties, maintained her equipment, and prepared for whatever challenges the day might bring. The base around her hummed with the constant activity of soldiers performing maintenance, standing guard duty, and preparing for patrols that would venture into the hostile territory surrounding their position. What none of them could have anticipated was that before the sun reached its zenith over the mountain peaks, their isolated outpost would come under attack by a force large enough to overwhelm their defenses. More importantly, they could never have imagined that their survival would depend on the combat skills of the medic they had dismissed as support personnel, the woman whose true capabilities remained hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic indifference and institutional prejudice. Elena Martinez stood in the doorway of the medical aid station, looking out at the base that had become her world for the past 8 months. The morning sun was climbing higher over the eastern peaks, promising another day of the routine challenges that define deployment life. She had no way of knowing that within hours, she would be fighting for her life and the lives of 4 critically wounded soldiers, using skills that nobody at FOB Sentinel knew she possessed. The attack, when it came, would strip away every assumption about roles, capabilities, and the true nature of courage under fire. Elena Martinez was about to demonstrate that the designation, just a medic, meant nothing when lives were on the line and survival depended on the willingness to fight with everything you had, regardless of what others expected from you. The mess hall at Forward Operating Base Sentinel buzzed with the familiar sounds of soldiers beginning their day. Metal trays clattering against stainless steel serving surfaces and boots scraping against concrete floors that had been mopped clean, but never quite lost their accumulated patina of dust and wear. Elena Martinez moved through the breakfast line with practiced efficiency, accepting portions of scrambled eggs that bore only passing resemblance to their fresh counterparts, and coffee that had been brewing since before dawn in industrial quantities that prioritized caffeine delivery over taste. She found an empty table near the corner of the dining area, a position that offered clear sightlines to both entrances while keeping her back to a solid wall. The seating choice was automatic, a habit developed through years of training that emphasized situational awareness and tactical positioning, even in seemingly safe environments. Elena pulled out a well-worn paperback novel and propped it against her water bottle, creating the appearance of casual reading while maintaining peripheral awareness of the conversations and activities around her. The book was a mystery novel that she had read 3 times already, but it served as both entertainment and camouflage in the social dynamics of the mess hall. Soldiers who were eating alone while reading appeared occupied and were less likely to be drawn into conversations that might lead to uncomfortable questions about backgrounds, qualifications, or the complex web of military politics that determined assignments and career trajectories. Elena had become expert at appearing approachable when necessary while maintaining professional distance when anonymity was preferable. Staff Sergeant Torres entered the mess hall with his usual entourage of infantry soldiers, their conversation loud enough to be heard across the dining area as they discussed the previous day's patrol and the intelligence briefings that suggested increased insurgent activity in their operational area. Torres commanded attention through a combination of legitimate combat experience and the kind of natural leadership presence that made subordinates want to follow his example. His voice carried the authority of someone who had earned his rank through competence rather than politics, though his attitudes toward support personnel revealed blind spots that compromised his effectiveness as a leader. Elena continued reading her novel while listening to Torres describe the tactical challenges of operating in mountainous terrain where insurgents could observe base activities from elevated positions that were difficult to assault or monitor continuously. His analysis was competent and demonstrated genuine understanding of the operational environment, but his dismissive comments about the support personnel who enabled combat operations revealed a narrow perspective that was unfortunately common among infantry soldiers who viewed warfare as exclusively their domain. Corporal Mitchell joined the conversation with observations about equipment maintenance challenges in the high-altitude environment, where temperature extremes and thin air created problems that required constant attention and creative solutions. Mitchell's technical knowledge was solid, and his dedication to maintaining combat readiness was unquestionable, but his tendency to echo Torres's attitudes toward support roles made him a reliable amplifier for the staff sergeant's prejudices. The conversation shifted to medical support capabilities when Private Chun mentioned a minor injury he had sustained during the previous patrol, a cut on his hand that had required basic first aid treatment. Torres used the opportunity to comment on the base's medical support, his voice carrying the kind of casual dismissal that suggested Elena's presence was a necessary inconvenience rather than a vital combat capability. Elena heard her name mentioned in connection with observations about medical qualifications and the difference between combat medics and real soldiers, comments delivered with the assumption that she was either too far away to hear or too professionally constrained to respond. The words stung not because they were unexpected, but because they reflected genuine misunderstanding about the nature of military medicine and the qualifications required to keep soldiers alive in combat environments. The conversation continued, with speculation about Elena's combat experience and whether medics could truly understand the challenges faced by infantry soldiers who engaged the enemy directly. Torres expressed doubt about whether support personnel possessed the mental toughness required for sustained combat operations, his comments revealing assumptions about courage, competence, and the relative value of different military specialties. Elena turned a page in her novel while listening to Mitchell at his own, observations about medical training and the perceived limitations of soldiers who had never engaged in direct combat with enemy forces. The irony was profound, given that Elena's combat experience exceeded that of every soldier in the mess hall, but she maintained her appearance of casual reading while absorbing comments that revealed the depth of misconceptions about her background and capabilities. Private Chen contributed to the discussion with questions about whether medics received adequate weapons training and whether they could be relied upon to provide effective support during firefights. His concerns were legitimate from a tactical perspective, reflecting genuine worry about unit cohesion and mutual support during combat operations, but they demonstrated complete ignorance about the training requirements for Special Forces medical personnel. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sergeant Gonzalez, who approached Torres with updates about communication intercepts that suggested possible insurgent activity in their area of operations. Gonzalez was professional and competent, delivering her intelligence briefing with the kind of crisp efficiency that characterized experienced military communications specialists. Her presence also shifted the conversation away from medical support capabilities toward immediate operational concerns. Elena finished her breakfast while listening to the tactical discussion that followed Gonzalez's briefing. The intelligence suggested that insurgent forces were planning coordinated attacks against coalition forces in the region, with Forward Operating Base Sentinel identified as a potential target due to its strategic location and relatively small garrison. The threat assessment indicated that any attack would likely involve multiple approaches and sustained engagement designed to overwhelm defensive capabilities. Torres received the intelligence briefing with the kind of professional attention that demonstrated his competence as a combat leader, asking relevant questions about timing, force estimates, and recommended defensive preparations. His tactical knowledge was solid, and his concern for his soldiers' welfare was genuine, even if his understanding of support capabilities remained limited by institutional prejudices and narrow combat experience. Elena gathered her breakfast tray and moved toward the cleaning area, passing close enough to Torres's table to hear additional details about the intelligence briefing and defensive preparations. The information suggested that they might face significant combat action within the next 48 hours, intelligence that made her reflect on her medical preparations and the adequacy of supplies for treating multiple casualties under sustained fire. The cleaning area buzzed with activity as soldiers disposed of breakfast trays and prepared to begin their daily duties. Elena moved through the routine efficiently, her mind already shifting toward the medical preparations that would be necessary if the intelligence briefing proved accurate. Multiple casualty events required different supplies and procedures than routine medical support, demanding advanced trauma capabilities that exceeded basic combat medic training. She left the mess hall and walked across the compound toward the medical aid station, her pace unhurried but purposeful as she considered the defensive preparations that would be necessary to protect wounded soldiers during sustained combat. The medical aid station's location provided some protection from small arms fire, but direct assault or sustained bombardment could compromise the facility's ability to provide effective medical support. Elena entered the medical aid station and immediately began checking supplies that would be critical during mass casualty events. Advanced trauma supplies, surgical instruments, blood products, and pain medications all required verification and organization to ensure rapid access. During emergency situations, the inventory process was systematic and thorough, reflecting training that emphasized preparation and redundancy in medical logistics. The morning light streaming through the narrow windows of the medical aid station illuminated dust particles that danced in the air currents created by the ventilation system. Elena worked methodically through her supply checks, her hands moving with practiced efficiency while her mind considered tactical medical scenarios that might develop if the base came under sustained attack. She paused at a locked cabinet that contained controlled substances and advanced medical equipment, supplies that exceeded standard combat medic authorization, but had been included in her personal kit during the transfer from her previous assignment. The bureaucratic oversight that had allowed her to retain advanced medical supplies was the same inefficiency that had buried her Special Forces qualifications in personnel files that were never consulted. Elena opened the cabinet and inventoried supplies that included surgical instruments, advanced airway management equipment, and medications that were typically available only to military physicians or specially trained medics. The equipment represented capabilities that could mean the difference between life and death during complex trauma cases, but using it would require revealing qualifications that she had kept hidden for 8 months. The radio in the medical aid station crackled with routine communication traffic, but Elena's trained ear detected subtle changes in tone and frequency that suggested heightened alertness throughout the base. The intelligence briefing from Sergeant Gonzalez was being disseminated through normal channels, creating the kind of background tension that preceded significant combat operations. Elena completed her supply inventory and moved to the treatment area, where she began preparing additional equipment that might be needed during emergency situations. The process involved arranging surgical instruments, checking emergency lighting systems, and ensuring that critical supplies were positioned for rapid access under potentially chaotic conditions. The medical aid station's communication system received an incoming transmission from higher command, requesting updates on medical readiness and casualty treatment capabilities. Elena responded with standard information about basic medical support, carefully avoiding mention of the advanced equipment and training that exceeded her official qualifications. The deception was necessary to avoid questions that might lead to unwanted scrutiny of her background and previous assignments. She spent the remainder of the morning organizing medical supplies and reviewing emergency procedures, her preparation reflecting both official requirements and personal knowledge gained through years of advanced medical training. The routine was familiar and comforting, providing structure and purpose while allowing her mind to process the tactical implications of the intelligence briefing. Elena's medical preparations were interrupted by the arrival of Tom Rodriguez, who entered the aid station with a minor cut on his forearm that required cleaning and bandaging. Tom was genuinely friendly and respectful, treating Elena as a valued colleague rather than subordinate support personnel. His injury was routine, requiring basic first aid that demonstrated Elena's competence without revealing the full extent of her medical capabilities. The conversation with Tom provided insight into the base's overall preparation for potential combat action, as he described maintenance activities and defensive preparations that were being implemented throughout the compound. Tom's perspective was valuable because his work in the motor pool gave him visibility into activities across multiple units and specialties. Elena treated Tom's injury with professional efficiency, cleaning the wound and applying appropriate bandaging while engaging in casual conversation that helped maintain the appearance of routine medical support. Her treatment was competent and thorough, demonstrating the kind of basic medical skills that were expected from combat medics without revealing advanced training that might prompt uncomfortable questions. After Tom's departure, Elena returned to her medical preparations with renewed focus on trauma supplies and emergency procedures. The intelligence briefing had created an undercurrent of tension throughout the base, and her medical training compelled her to prepare for scenarios that exceeded routine support requirements. The morning progressed with additional routine medical appointments and equipment checks, each interaction reinforcing Elena's role as competent but unremarkable support personnel. She maintained professional demeanor while carefully avoiding any demonstration of capabilities that exceeded standard combat medic training, a performance that required constant attention to prevent inadvertent revelation of her true qualifications. Elena's careful management of perceptions had been necessary throughout her 8 months at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, where revealing her Special Forces background would have created questions about her current assignment and the circumstances that had led to her apparent demotion. The military bureaucracy that had buried her qualifications also provided protection from scrutiny that might compromise her ability to serve effectively in her current role. The afternoon briefing at Forward Operating Base Sentinel took place in the command post, a concrete structure that served as the nerve center for tactical operations and administrative coordination. The building's interior was dominated by communication equipment, tactical displays, and maps that showed the operational area surrounding their isolated position. Fluorescent lighting created harsh shadows that emphasized the serious expressions of soldiers who were receiving updates about potential threats and defensive preparations. Elena Martinez stood near the back of the briefing room, her position reflecting the informal hierarchy that placed medical support personnel behind combat armed soldiers in the social order of military briefings. She held a small notebook and pen, ostensibly for recording medical information relevant to potential casualty scenarios, but actually listening to tactical discussions that might affect her preparation for treating wounded soldiers under fire. Lieutenant Colonel Santos entered the briefing room with the kind of measured authority that characterized senior officers who had earned their rank through competence rather than politics. Santos was responsible for the overall security and operational effectiveness of Forward Operating Base Sentinel, a challenging assignment that required balancing multiple competing priorities while maintaining combat readiness in an isolated and potentially hostile environment. The briefing began with intelligence updates from Sergeant Gonzalez, who presented information about insurgent activity patterns and communication intercepts that suggested coordinated attacks against coalition forces. The intelligence picture was concerning, but not unprecedented, indicating threat levels that were manageable through standard defensive procedures and enhanced vigilance. What made the briefing significant was the specific mention of Forward Operating Base Sentinel as a priority target for insurgent forces, seeking to demonstrate their capability against isolated coalition positions. Staff Sergeant Torres participated in the tactical discussion with competent analysis of defensive positions and patrol requirements, his contributions reflecting genuine understanding of infantry tactics and small unit operations. Torres commanded respect from his subordinates and peers through demonstrated leadership under fire, but his perspective on military operations remained narrow, focused on direct combat roles while minimizing the importance of support functions. The tactical discussion expanded to include logistics support, communication requirements, and medical preparation for potential casualties. Elena listened carefully to conversations about defensive positioning and casualty evacuation procedures, information that would be critical for establishing medical treatment areas and ensuring adequate protection for wounded soldiers during sustained combat. Lieutenant Colonel Santos addressed the medical support situation directly, asking about casualty treatment capabilities and evacuation procedures for seriously wounded personnel. The question was routine and professional, reflecting standard military planning that considered medical support as one element in overall operational readiness. Elena stepped forward to provide information about medical capabilities, delivering a concise briefing that covered basic trauma treatment available, supplies and procedures for requesting medical evacuation when helicopter transport was available. Her presentation was professional and complete, addressing standard medical support requirements without revealing advanced capabilities that exceeded her official qualifications. Staff Sergeant Torres interrupted Elena's medical briefing with questions about her combat experience and whether medical personnel could be relied upon to provide effective support during sustained firefights. His questions were delivered in a tone that suggested concern for unit effectiveness rather than personal animosity, but they reflected assumptions about medical personnel that revealed fundamental misunderstanding about military medicine requirements. Elena responded to Torres's questions with factual information about combat medic training and deployment experience, carefully avoiding details that might reveal the full extent of her background or previous assignments. Her answers satisfied official requirements while maintaining the fiction that she was a STANDARD combat medic with routine qualifications and limited combat exposure. Corporal Mitchell added his own observations about medical support during previous operations, expressing doubt about whether medics possessed adequate weapons training to defend themselves and their patients during direct combat with enemy forces. Mitchell's concerns were tactical rather than personal, reflecting legitimate worry about unit cohesion and mutual support during firefights, but they demonstrated complete ignorance about Special Forces medical training requirements. The conversation continued with additional questions about medical evacuation procedures and the time required to stabilize wounded soldiers for transport to advanced medical facilities. Elena provided standard information about basic trauma treatment and evacuation protocols, maintaining professional demeanor while listening to comments that revealed the depth of misconceptions about military medical capabilities. Private Chen contributed observations about medical support during patrol operations, questioning whether medics could maintain pace with infantry soldiers during extended operations in mountainous terrain. Chen's comments reflected genuine concern about operational effectiveness, but they demonstrated assumptions about physical fitness and combat readiness that revealed prejudices about support personnel versus combat soldiers. Elena absorbed the questions and comments without visible reaction, maintaining professional composure, while noting the specific misconceptions that would need to be addressed through performance rather than explanation. The briefing continued with discussions of ammunition supply, communication procedures, and coordination with higher command elements, topics that directly affected medical operations, but were discussed without input from medical personnel. Lieutenant Colonel Santos concluded the briefing with assignments and preparation timelines, emphasizing the importance of readiness and coordination between different elements of the base defense. Santos was competent and professional, treating all personnel with appropriate respect while maintaining clear command authority and operational focus. Elena left the briefing room with a clear understanding of the tactical situation and her expected role in defensive preparations. The intelligence suggested that combat action was likely within the next 24 to 48 hours, requiring medical preparation that exceeded routine support activities. More importantly, the briefing had reinforced her understanding of how other soldiers viewed medical capabilities and the assumptions that shaped their expectations about support under fire. The afternoon continued with routine medical activities and preparation for potential casualties, but Elena's mind remained focused on the tactical implications of the morning's briefing. The defensive plans were competent and appropriate for the threat level, but they reflected standard assumptions about medical support that might prove inadequate if the base faced sustained assault or complex casualty scenarios. Elena returned to the medical aid station and began advanced preparation for trauma treatment under combat conditions, organizing supplies and equipment that exceeded standard combat medic requirements. The preparation was systematic and thorough, reflecting training and experience that she had carefully concealed for 8 months to avoid questions about her background and current assignment. She spent time reviewing evacuation routes and defensive positions around the medical aid station, considering how to protect wounded soldiers during sustained combat while maintaining access to critical medical equipment and supplies. The tactical analysis required understanding both medical requirements and combat dynamics, knowledge that she possessed but had never demonstrated to her colleagues at Forward Operating Base Sentinel. Elena's preparation was interrupted by another visit from Staff Sergeant Torres, who entered the medical aid station with questions about casualty treatment procedures and medical evacuation timelines. Torres was professional but distant, treating Elena as competent support personnel rather than a tactical asset who might contribute to defensive planning. The conversation with Torres revealed additional assumptions about medical capabilities and the role of support personnel during combat operations. Torres viewed medical support as a necessary but secondary consideration, important for treating casualties, but not integral to tactical planning or defensive operations. His perspective was common among infantry soldiers who understood their own specialties thoroughly, but had limited knowledge about the complexity and capabilities of support functions. Elena provided standard information about medical procedures and evacuation requirements, maintaining her careful performance as routine combat medic while avoiding any demonstration of knowledge that might prompt questions about her background. The deception had become automatic after 8 months of concealing her true qualifications, but it remained psychologically challenging to accept dismissive treatment from soldiers whose combat experience was significantly less extensive than her own. Torres left the medical aid station with apparent satisfaction about medical readiness, his confidence based on standard assumptions about combat medic capabilities rather than understanding of Elena's actual qualifications and experience. The interaction reinforced Elena's understanding of how she was perceived by other soldiers and the expectations that would shape their behavior during combat operations. Elena spent the remainder of the afternoon organizing medical supplies and reviewing emergency procedures, her preparation reflecting both official requirements and personal knowledge that exceeded standard combat medic training. The work was familiar and methodical, providing structure and purpose while allowing her mind to process the tactical challenges that lay ahead. The base around her hummed with preparation activities as soldiers conducted equipment checks, reviewed defensive positions, and prepared for potential combat action. Elena could hear the sounds of weapons maintenance, vehicle preparation, and communication checks through the walls of the medical aid station, background noise that created an atmosphere of controlled tension and professional readiness. Elena's medical preparation continued into the evening hours as she organized trauma supplies and reviewed procedures for treating multiple casualties under fire. The preparation was comprehensive and systematic, reflecting years of experience in forward medical support that her colleagues had no reason to suspect. The personnel file that followed Elena Martinez through her military career told only part of her story, the sanitized version that bureaucratic necessity required while concealing the circumstances that had led to her current assignment at Forward Operating Base Sentinel. The file contained records of her basic combat medic training, routine performance evaluations, and standard administrative information that revealed nothing about the specialized training and combat experience that defined her actual capabilities. What the file didn't mention, what had been carefully buried beneath layers of administrative classification and need-to-know restrictions, was that Elena Martinez had spent 4 years as a Special Forces medical sergeant with the 7th Special Forces Group, serving multiple deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq in roles that required advanced medical training and direct combat operations behind enemy lines. Her actual military occupation specialty was 18 Delta, Special Forces Medical Sergeant, a qualification that represented some of the most demanding medical training available in the United States military. The path to Special Forces had begun during Elena's initial enlistment, when her performance in basic combat medic training had attracted attention from recruiters, looking for candidates with exceptional potential for advanced medical specialties. Elena had scored in the top percentile on medical aptitude tests and demonstrated the kind of calm competence under pressure that characterized successful military medical personnel. Special Forces medical training had consumed 18 months of intensive instruction that combined advanced trauma surgery, field medicine, and combat operations in a curriculum designed to produce medics capable of operating independently in hostile environments without external medical support. The training included surgical procedures that exceeded most civilian emergency physicians, combat tactics that rivaled infantry specialists, and psychological preparation for operating under extreme stress in life or death situations. Elena had excelled in every phase of Special Forces medical training, earning commendations for technical proficiency, leadership potential, and performance under simulated combat conditions. Her instructors recognized exceptional talent and recommended her for additional specialized training in advanced trauma surgery and emergency medicine techniques that were typically reserved for military physicians. The advanced medical training had included surgical procedures for treating complex battlefield injuries. Emergency medicine techniques for managing multiple casualties simultaneously, and innovative treatment methods for situations were standard. Medical resources were unavailable. Elena had learned to perform emergency surgery using improvised instruments, to create life support systems from battlefield materials, and to make rapid triage decisions that determined who lived and who died when medical resources were overwhelmed. Her first deployment as a Special Forces medic had been to Afghanistan, where she served with Operational Detachment Alpha 7312 in missions that required deep infiltration into hostile territory and extended operations without external support. The team had conducted reconnaissance missions, direct action operations, and foreign internal defense activities that placed them in sustained contact with enemy forces while operating hundreds of miles from conventional medical support. Elena's medical capabilities had been tested repeatedly during that first deployment, as she treated complex combat injuries under fire, performed emergency surgery in field conditions that would challenge fully equipped hospitals, and managed casualty treatment for both American forces and local civilians caught in combat operations. Her performance had earned respect from Special Forces operators who understood the difference between routine medical support and the advanced capabilities required for independent operations. The surgical procedures she had performed during Special Forces deployments included emergency amputations to save lives when limbs were destroyed by explosive devices, thoracic surgery to repair punctured lungs and damaged organs, and complex trauma reconstruction that required hours of precise work under primitive conditions. Elena had developed innovative techniques for managing pain, preventing infection, and stabilizing patients for evacuation when helicopter transport was delayed or unavailable. Her second deployment had been to Iraq, where Operational Detachment Alpha 7312 had conducted counter-terrorism operations in urban environments that required different medical skills and tactical approaches. The urban combat environment presented unique challenges for medical support, including treating injuries from improvised explosive devices, managing civilian casualties during military operations, and providing medical support during sustained firefights in built-up areas. Elena had earned additional specialized training in combat trauma psychology, learning to recognize and treat post-traumatic stress reactions that could compromise operational effectiveness. The training had included techniques for managing her own stress reactions while maintaining medical performance under extreme conditions, knowledge that proved invaluable during extended combat operations, where medical personnel faced the same psychological pressures as combat soldiers. The incident that had ended Elena's Special Forces career had occurred during her third deployment, when Operational Detachment Alpha 7312 had been conducting village medical outreach as part of a Hearts and Minds operation designed to build local support for coalition forces. A coordinated insurgent attack had resulted in multiple casualties among both American forces and Afghan civilians, creating a mass casualty situation that required immediate triage and treatment decisions. Elena had been the senior medical authority on scene when the attack occurred, responsible for making treatment decisions that would determine survival chances for wounded personnel. The tactical situation had been complex, with ongoing enemy fire, limited medical supplies, and casualties that included both military personnel and civilians with varying degrees of injury severity. The triage decisions that Elena had made during that attack had prioritized treatment based on medical criteria rather than military status, focusing resources on patients with the greatest survival chances regardless of whether they were American soldiers or Afghan civilians. Her decisions had been medically sound and ethically justified, but they had conflicted with the expectations of her commanding officer, Major David Harrison, who believed that American military personnel should receive priority treatment regardless of injury severity. The conflict with Major Harrison had escalated when Elena had refused to redirect medical resources from treating seriously wounded Afghan children to providing comfort care for American soldiers whose injuries were fatal regardless of treatment intensity. Elena's medical training and ethical obligations had compelled her to focus on patients who could be saved, while Harrison's military perspective had demanded priority for American forces, even when treatment would be futile. The subsequent investigation had vindicated Elena's medical decisions, with review boards concluding that her triage choices had been appropriate and had resulted in maximum lives saved given available resources. However, the conflict with Major Harrison had created political complications that affected Elena's career trajectory within Special Forces units, where unit cohesion and command authority were considered paramount. The administrative resolution of the incident had been Elena's transfer to conventional medical units where her advanced training could be utilized, without the command complications that had emerged during Special Forces operations. The transfer had been presented as routine reassignment, but Elena understood that her Special Forces career had been effectively terminated by challenging a superior officer's judgment even when she had been medically and ethically correct. The bureaucratic machinery that had processed Elena's transfer had focused on administrative efficiency rather than preserving specialized training and experience. Her Special Forces qualifications had been noted in personnel files, but not actively considered when making assignment decisions, resulting in her placement in conventional combat medic positions that utilized only a fraction of her actual capabilities. Elena had accepted the transfer without protest, understanding that fighting the administrative decision would likely result in more severe consequences, including possible discharge from military service. She had chosen to preserve her ability to serve as a medic, even in diminished capacity, rather than risk losing the opportunity to use her medical skills in military service entirely. The transition from Special Forces medical sergeant to conventional combat medic had required psychological adjustment as Elena adapted to working within more restrictive guidelines and with less autonomy than she had experienced during Special Forces operations. The routine medical support activities at Forward Operating Base Sentinel utilized only basic medical skills, requiring Elena to consciously limit her performance to avoid revealing capabilities that exceeded standard combat medic training. Elena had maintained her advanced medical skills through private study and practice, reviewing surgical techniques and emergency procedures during off-duty hours to prevent deterioration of capabilities that had required years to develop. She had also continued physical training regimens that exceeded standard requirements, maintaining the fitness levels required for Special Forces operations, even though her current assignment demanded less physical capability. The locked cabinet in the medical aid station contained equipment and supplies that Elena had accumulated during her transfer from Special Forces units, advanced medical materials that had been included in her personal kit through bureaucratic oversight rather than intentional allocation. The equipment represented surgical capabilities that could save lives during complex trauma cases, but using it would require revealing qualifications that she had concealed for 8 months. Elena's concealed background also included extensive weapons training and combat experience that exceeded most infantry soldiers at Forward Operating Base Sentinel. Special Forces medical personnel were required to maintain proficiency with multiple weapon systems and to demonstrate combat effectiveness that enabled them to operate independently in hostile environments where medical personnel might need to fight as well as heal. The weapons qualifications in Elena's buried personnel file included expert ratings with rifle, pistol, and specialized weapon systems, plus additional training in explosives, tactical driving, and hand-to-hand combat. Techniques. The training had been designed to ensure that Special Forces medics could defend themselves and their patients during combat operations where external security might not be available. Elena had maintained her weapons proficiency through practice at the base firing range, but she had been careful to demonstrate only standard combat medic competency to avoid questions about her background. The performance required conscious restraint to prevent inadvertent revelation of advanced training that would prompt unwanted scrutiny of her qualifications and previous assignments. The abandoned storage bunker on the eastern perimeter of Forward Operating Base Sentinel had been constructed during the initial establishment of the facility, designed to house ammunition and supplies that were later relocated to more centrally positioned facilities as the base layout evolved. The concrete structure remained sound and secure, but its remote location and superseded function had relegated it to unofficial storage for equipment that was technically surplus but might prove useful for undefined future requirements. Elena Martinez had discovered the bunker during her second month at the base, while conducting a comprehensive survey of medical evacuation routes and potential casualty collection points that might be needed during mass casualty events. The official purpose of her survey had been routine medical planning, but her Special Forces background had compelled her to identify tactical positions and resources that exceeded standard combat medic requirements. The bunker's interior was spacious enough to accommodate serious medical training activities while providing privacy from casual observation. Elena had gradually equipped the space with medical training materials, surgical instruments, and reference materials that supported maintenance of her advanced medical skills without revealing capabilities that exceeded her official qualifications. 3 times each week, Elena visited the bunker during evening hours when her duties at the medical aid station were complete and other base personnel were engaged in recreational activities or administrative tasks. The training sessions were systematic and comprehensive, designed to maintain surgical proficiency and emergency medicine skills that required regular practice to prevent deterioration. Elena's training routine began with review of surgical anatomy and advanced trauma procedures, using medical textbooks and reference materials that covered techniques significantly beyond basic combat medic instruction. She studied complex surgical procedures, innovative trauma treatments, and emergency medicine protocols that might be required during mass casualty events or when advanced medical support was unavailable. The practical component of Elena's training involved surgical simulation, using training materials that allowed practice of advanced procedures without living subjects. Elena had acquired surgical training models, suture practice materials, and simulated anatomy that enabled maintenance of manual dexterity and procedural familiarity that were essential for complex medical interventions. Elena practiced advanced airway management techniques that exceeded standard combat medic training, including surgical airway procedures that might be required when conventional intubation was impossible or inadequate. The procedures required precise manual control and anatomical knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death during respiratory emergencies caused by facial trauma or upper airway obstruction. Her training included practicing emergency surgical procedures that might be required when evacuation to advanced medical facilities was impossible or delayed. Elena rehearsed procedures for controlling massive hemorrhage, repairing damaged organs, and stabilizing complex fractures using improvised materials and limited equipment that might be available during combat operations. The bunker also served as a location for maintaining physical fitness that exceeded standard requirements for combat medic personnel. Elena's workout routine included strength training, cardiovascular conditioning, and tactical movement exercises that maintained the physical capabilities required for Special Forces operations, even though her current assignment demanded less physical performance. Elena practiced weapons handling and tactical movement techniques during her evening training sessions, maintaining proficiency with combat skills that were integral to Special Forces medical training but exceeded standard requirements for conventional combat medics. The practice was conducted using unloaded weapons and simulated scenarios that allowed skill maintenance without violating base security protocols. The weapons training included practicing medical treatment under simulated fire, combining advanced trauma procedures with tactical movement and weapons handling that might be required when treating casualties during ongoing combat operations. The scenarios were based on actual situations that Elena had encountered during Special Forces deployments. Realistic training that prepared for complex situations where medical and combat requirements intersected. Elena's bunker training also included psychological preparation for high-stress medical situations, using meditation and visualization techniques that helped maintain emotional control during life-or-death medical decisions. The mental training was designed to prevent decision-making deterioration under extreme stress, ensuring that advanced medical skills remained accessible when they were most critically needed. The training sessions were carefully scheduled to avoid detection by other base personnel who might question Elena's activities or wonder about capabilities that exceeded her official assignment. Elena varied her routes to and from the bunker, timing her visits to coincide with recreational activities that would explain her absence from routine social interactions in the barracks and common areas. Elena had established contingency procedures for concealing evidence of her advanced training if the bunker was discovered or if questions arose about her evening activities. The medical materials and training equipment were organized to appear consistent with routine combat medic education, rather than advanced surgical training, maintaining the fiction that her capabilities matched her official qualifications. The psychological challenge of maintaining advanced skills while concealing their existence had required constant vigilance and performance management that was exhausting beyond the physical demands of the training itself. Elena had to consistently demonstrate competence without excellence, showing sufficient medical capability to earn respect while avoiding performance that might prompt questions about her background. Elena's concealed training had been observed on several occasions by Specialist Tom Rodriguez, whose maintenance duties occasionally brought him to the perimeter areas during evening hours when Elena was traveling to or from the bunker. Tom had not questioned Elena's activities directly, but his respectful treatment and occasional comments suggested that he recognized capabilities that exceeded standard combat medic training. Tom's observations had been casual rather than systematic, but Elena understood that her secret training activities created risks that could compromise her carefully maintained anonymity if scrutiny intensified. She had developed explanations for her evening activities that would satisfy routine questioning while avoiding revelation of advanced capabilities that might prompt investigation of her background. The bunker training had also allowed Elena to experiment with innovative medical techniques and improvised equipment that might prove useful during emergency situations where standard medical resources were inadequate. She had developed procedures for creating surgical instruments from available materials, improvising life support equipment using base resources, and adapting standard supplies for advanced medical applications. Elena's improvisational medical training included techniques for performing surgery using non-medical tools, creating sterile environments in field conditions, and managing medical emergencies using resources that were available at Forward Operating Base Sentinel but not typically considered medical equipment. The innovations reflected Special Forces training that emphasized adaptability and creative problem-solving under resource constraints. The evening training sessions had become a psychological necessity as well as professional requirement, providing Elena with structured activities that maintained connection to her actual capabilities while preserving anonymity that protected her from unwanted scrutiny. The training represented the difference between accepting diminished role and maintaining readiness for situations that might require her full capabilities. Elena's bunker activities had also included preparation for scenarios where her concealed background might need to be revealed, developing plans for transitioning from routine combat medic to Special Forces medical sergeant if circumstances required utilization of her advanced training. The preparation included organizing equipment, reviewing procedures, and identifying resources that would support advanced medical operations. The most challenging aspect of Elena's secret training had been maintaining motivation and professional standards while serving in assignments that significantly underutilized her capabilities. The psychological toll of concealing competence and accepting dismissive treatment from less qualified personnel had required mental discipline that was more demanding than the physical challenges of maintaining advanced medical skills. Elena's training routine had evolved throughout her 8 months at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, adapting to changing schedules, varying base activities, and seasonal conditions that affected access to the bunker and availability of training. Time, the flexibility and persistence required to maintain secret training, reflected military discipline and personal commitment that characterized her approach to professional development. The most recent training sessions had focused on mass casualty management and trauma surgery under combat conditions, scenarios that seemed increasingly relevant given the intelligence briefings about potential insurgent attacks against Forward Operating Base Sentinel. Elena had intensified her preparation for complex medical situations that might require capabilities significantly beyond standard combat medic training. Elena understood that the intelligence briefings and heightened defensive preparations suggested that her concealed training might soon become relevant to actual operations rather than hypothetical preparation. The possibility that combat action might require revelation of her true capabilities created both anticipation and anxiety about ending 8 months of carefully maintained anonymity. The evening before the attack that would change everything, Elena had conducted her most comprehensive training session yet, reviewing all the advanced medical procedures and emergency techniques that had been her specialty during Special Forces operations. The training had been methodical and thorough, unconsciously preparing for challenges that she could not have anticipated, but for which her concealed background had prepared her completely. The first indication that Forward Operating Base Sentinel would face its greatest test came not through intelligence channels or reconnaissance reports, but through the subtle changes in local civilian behavior that experienced soldiers learned to recognize as harbingers of impending violence. Elena Martinez noticed these signs during her morning medical rounds, observing details that might have seemed insignificant to less experienced personnel but carried ominous implications for someone with her background in unconventional warfare operations. The local Afghan contractor who delivered fresh water to the base had failed to appear for his scheduled delivery, breaking a pattern of reliable service that had persisted for months without interruption. The absence might have been explained by mechanical problems, family obligations, or any number of routine complications that affected civilian operations in a war zone. But Elena's Special Forces experience had taught her to view such deviations as potential indicators of pending hostile action. Similarly, the small group of local children who often gathered near the base perimeter to observe American military activities and occasionally receive small gifts from sympathetic soldiers had been conspicuously absent for the past 2 days. The children's disappearance could indicate parental concern about potential danger, or it might reflect instructions from insurgent forces who were preparing operations that would make the area unsafe for civilian presence. Elena had noticed these subtle changes while conducting routine medical patrols around the base perimeter, officially checking on soldiers manning observation posts, but actually maintaining the situational awareness that her concealed background had made automatic. The absence of normal civilian activity patterns created an atmosphere of tension that was difficult to define but impossible to ignore for someone trained to recognize pre-combat indicators. The weather conditions added another layer of complexity to the developing situation, as seasonal wind patterns had shifted to create atmospheric conditions that would significantly impact military operations. The mountain valleys surrounding Forward Operating Base Sentinel were experiencing unusual temperature inversions that trapped dust and reduced visibility, while unpredictable wind gusts created challenges for helicopter operations that might be required for casualty evacuation or reinforcement. Elena understood that the combination of reduced visibility and limited helicopter access would create tactical advantages for insurgent forces while complicating defensive operations and medical evacuation procedures. The weather conditions were natural phenomena rather than enemy action, but they would significantly impact any combat operations that developed over the next several days. The base communication systems had been experiencing intermittent problems that might have been attributed to atmospheric conditions or equipment aging, but the pattern of failures suggested possible electronic warfare activities that could indicate sophisticated preparation for coordinated attacks. Elena had overheard communications personnel discussing signal degradation and equipment malfunctions that seemed to follow patterns rather than occurring randomly. The timing of the communication problems coincided with other suspicious indicators in ways that suggested deliberate coordination rather than coincidental technical difficulties. Elena's Special Forces background had included training in recognizing enemy preparation activities, and the combination of civilian behavior changes, weather complications, and communication problems created a threat profile that was deeply concerning. Elena's concerns were validated when Sergeant Gonzalez approached her during afternoon medical rounds with unofficial questions about medical preparation for potential mass casualty events. Gonzalez was too professional to violate operational security by discussing classified intelligence, but her inquiries about trauma supplies and evacuation procedures suggested that communication intercepts had detected specific threats against Forward Operating Base Sentinel. The conversation with Gonzalez revealed that base leadership was taking the threat indicators seriously and implementing enhanced defensive measures that included medical preparation for sustained combat operations. Elena provided standard information about medical readiness while carefully concealing her understanding of the tactical implications and her preparation for scenarios that exceeded routine medical support requirements. Elena spent the remainder of the afternoon conducting discrete preparation for medical emergencies that might require capabilities beyond standard combat medic training. She organized advanced trauma supplies in ways that would allow rapid access during chaotic situations, reviewed evacuation routes that would protect wounded soldiers during ongoing combat, and mentally rehearsed procedures for treating multiple casualties under fire. The base around her hummed with heightened activity as soldiers conducted additional weapons maintenance, checked defensive positions, and prepared equipment for potential sustained operations. The increased activity level was subtle but noticeable to someone with Elena's experience, indicating professional concern among leadership without creating obvious panic or disruption of routine operations. Elena's medical preparation included reviewing contingency plans for protecting wounded soldiers if the medical aid station came under direct attack, scenarios that would require tactical decisions about patient evacuation, equipment preservation, and continuation of medical operations under hostile fire. The planning reflected Special Forces training that integrated medical and tactical considerations rather than treating them as separate specialties. The evening hours brought additional confirmation that the threat assessment was serious, as base security was enhanced through measures that included additional perimeter patrols, increased communication monitoring, and preparation of defensive positions that had remained unmanned during routine operations. Elena observed these changes while maintaining her routine medical duties, Noting tactical preparations that suggested leadership expected significant combat action. Elena's concealed background allowed her to recognize defensive preparations that exceeded routine security measures, indicating that intelligence sources had provided specific information about timing, force size, or tactical approaches that insurgent forces planned to employ against Forward Operating Base Sentinel. The preparations were competent and appropriate, but they reflected conventional military thinking that might prove inadequate against unconventional assault tactics. The base command structure had implemented enhanced readiness measures while maintaining operational security that prevented detailed information from reaching personnel who did not require tactical knowledge for their assigned duties. Elena's position as medical support meant that she received only general guidance about potential casualties and evacuation procedures, but her special forces experience allowed her to infer significant details from incomplete information. Elena spent the evening hours in her quarters, reviewing advanced medical procedures and emergency treatment protocols that might be required during sustained combat operations. The review was systematic and comprehensive, covering trauma surgery, techniques, mass casualty management, and innovative treatment methods that could save lives when standard medical resources were overwhelmed or unavailable. Her preparation included mental rehearsal of complex medical scenarios that combined trauma treatment with tactical movement, weapons handling, and defensive operations that might be required if medical personnel became directly engaged in combat. Operations. The scenarios reflected actual situations that Elena had encountered during Special Forces deployments, realistic preparation for challenges that exceeded standard combat medic training. Elena's evening preparation also included organizing personal equipment and supplies that would support extended medical operations under adverse conditions. She checked weapons, ammunition, and tactical gear that officially exceeded combat medic requirements, but might prove essential if the base faced sustained assault that required all personnel to contribute to defensive operations. The psychological preparation for potential combat was as important as the tactical and medical preparation, requiring mental conditioning that would maintain decision-making capability under extreme stress while preserving the advanced medical skills that could save lives during critical situations. Elena's Special Forces background had included extensive training in stress management and psychological resilience that remained relevant to her current situation. Elena's final preparation activity was updating personal documentation and emergency notifications that would ensure appropriate handling of her remains and notification of family members if she was killed during combat operations. The preparation was routine for deployment environments, but the current threat level made such considerations more immediate and relevant than usual. As Elena completed her evening preparations and attempted to rest before what might prove to be a challenging day, she reflected on the irony of her situation at Forward Operating Base Sentinel. The soldiers who questioned her combat readiness and dismissed her capabilities would soon face a test that might require exactly the advanced training and experience that her concealed background provided. The base around her was quiet but tense, with the kind of controlled alertness that characterized military units preparing for significant combat operations. Elena understood that the next 24 hours would likely determine whether the defensive preparations were adequate and whether her concealed capabilities would finally be revealed through circumstances that demanded their utilization. Elena's last conscious thought before falling into the light sleep that deployment conditions required was wondering whether the coming test would validate her years of preparation or reveal that even her extensive training was inadequate for the challenges that Forward Operating Base Sentinel would soon face. The attack on Forward Operating Base Sentinel began at 0347 hours with a coordinated barrage of mortar rounds that demonstrated tactical sophistication far exceeding the capabilities typically associated with local insurgent forces. The initial bombardment was precisely targeted to neutralize communication equipment, disable vehicle assets, and suppress defensive positions while creating maximum psychological impact through simultaneous explosions that shattered the pre-dawn quiet with devastating effectiveness. Elena Martinez was instantly awake when the first explosion illuminated her quarters with brilliant orange light, followed immediately by the concussive blast that rattled windows and sent dust cascading from ceiling fixtures. Her Special Forces training provided immediate tactical assessment of the situation, recognizing the coordinated nature of the attack and the professional competence that characterized the timing and target selection. The mortar barrage continued for exactly 90 seconds, a duration that suggested careful planning designed to achieve maximum disruption while conserving ammunition for sustained operations. Elena counted 12 separate impact points that indicated multiple firing positions, coordinated through communication systems that demonstrated organizational capability significantly beyond typical insurgent operations in the region. Elena moved rapidly through her quarters, donning full combat equipment while mentally cataloging the tactical implications of the attack patterns. The precision of the bombardment suggested detailed reconnaissance of base layout and defensive positions, indicating that insurgent forces possessed intelligence about Forward Operating Base Sentinel that enabled them to plan sophisticated assault operations rather than opportunistic harassment. The medical aid station had been spared direct hits during the initial bombardment, but Elena could see through her window that the communication center and motor pool had sustained significant damage that would impact base defensive capabilities and casualty evacuation procedures. The targeting suggested that insurgent forces understood the functional importance of different facilities rather than attacking randomly. Elena grabbed her medical kit and advanced trauma supplies while listening to the sounds of soldiers responding to the attack, shouting commands and status reports that indicated the base was transitioning rapidly from routine operations to combat readiness. The professional response demonstrated effective training and leadership, but Elena's experience suggested that the initial bombardment was only the first phase of a more complex assault plan. The base alarm system activated belatedly, its wailing siren adding to the chaos of explosion aftermath and soldier responses, while providing official confirmation of what everyone already understood through direct experience. Elena could hear the distinctive sounds of weapons being charged and defensive positions being manned as Forward Operating Base Sentinel prepared for whatever would follow the initial bombardment. Elena left her quarters and moved rapidly toward the medical aid station, her route taking her past damaged facilities and soldiers, conducting damage assessment while maintaining defensive vigilance. The scene was controlled chaos, with professional military responses occurring simultaneously as personnel addressed immediate threats while preparing for sustained combat operations. The medical aid station had sustained minor damage from blast effects and debris, but the primary medical equipment and trauma supplies remained functional and accessible. Elena conducted rapid assessment of medical capabilities while listening to radio traffic that provided fragments of tactical information about the developing situation around the base perimeter. The radio communications revealed that the mortar attack had been followed by probing actions against perimeter observation posts, with small groups of insurgents testing defensive responses while remaining beyond effective range of base weapon systems. The probing suggested professional tactical reconnaissance designed to identify defensive weaknesses and response capabilities before committing to major assault operations. Elena organized medical supplies for mass casualty treatment while monitoring tactical communications that provided increasing detail about the scope and sophistication of the insurgent assault. The radio traffic indicated that Forward Operating Base Sentinel was facing coordinated attacks from multiple directions, with insurgent forces demonstrating capabilities that exceeded intelligence estimates about local threat levels. Staff Sergeant Torres appeared in the medical aid station doorway, his combat equipment hastily donned but complete. his expression reflecting professional concern about the tactical situation without obvious panic or confusion. Torres was competent under pressure, Elena recognized, even if his understanding of support capabilities remained limited by conventional military thinking. Torres briefed Elena about the tactical situation with clipped professional efficiency, explaining that the base was under coordinated assault from estimated 40 to 60 insurgents using weapons and tactics that suggested professional military training rather than typical insurgent operations. The force size and tactical sophistication represented a significant escalation from previous threat assessments for the region. The briefing revealed that insurgent forces had established blocking positions on the primary access routes to Forward Operating Base Sentinel, effectively isolating the base from external support while preparing for sustained assault operations. The isolation meant that casualty evacuation would be impossible until the tactical situation was resolved, placing complete responsibility for medical treatment on Elena's capabilities. Elena absorbed the tactical briefing while continuing medical preparation, her special forces background allowing her to understand implications that exceeded the information Torres was able to provide. The insurgent tactics suggested coordination, with external support and intelligence capabilities that indicated sophisticated planning, rather than opportunistic local operations. Torres continued his briefing by explaining that base leadership expected casualty levels that would exceed routine medical support capabilities, requiring Elena to prepare for treating multiple seriously wounded soldiers simultaneously while potentially operating under direct fire if insurgent forces succeeded in penetrating base defenses. The tactical situation described by Torres matched scenarios that Elena had encountered during special forces operations, complex combat environments where medical personnel were required to function as both healers and fighters while maintaining life-saving capabilities under extreme stress. The familiarity was reassuring, even as it confirmed the seriousness of the threat facing Forward Operating Base Sentinel. Elena provided Torres with standard information about medical readiness and casualty treatment capabilities, carefully avoiding details that might reveal advanced training while ensuring that he understood the basic medical support that would be available during sustained combat operations. The conversation remained professional and focused on immediate tactical requirements. Torres left the medical aid station to coordinate defensive preparations, but his parting comments revealed assumptions about medical capabilities and Elena's role during combat operations that reflected the same institutional prejudices that had characterized his previous interactions. Elena recognized that the coming combat would either validate or challenge those assumptions through circumstances that would demand performance rather than explanation. Elena completed her medical preparation while listening to intensifying radio traffic that indicated insurgent forces were transitioning from reconnaissance to active assault operations. The tactical communications revealed that perimeter observation posts were reporting direct fire from multiple positions, indicating that the assault was escalating beyond probing actions toward sustained engagement. The first casualties arrived at the medical aid station 20 minutes after the initial mortar attack, carried by soldiers who had sustained shrapnel wounds during the bombardment, but remained capable of movement and basic function. Elena treated the injuries with professional efficiency, providing trauma care that demonstrated competence without revealing advanced capabilities. The wounded soldiers provided additional tactical information about insurgent capabilities and assault patterns, describing coordinated attacks that utilized suppressive fire, tactical movement, and communication coordination that characterized professional military operations rather than improvised insurgent activities. The reports confirmed Elena's assessment that Forward Operating Base Sentinel faced a significant threat. Elena's treatment of the initial casualties revealed that insurgent forces were using weapons and ammunition that caused injury patterns consistent with military-grade equipment rather than improvised weapons typically associated with local insurgent operations. The medical evidence supported tactical assessments about the sophistication and external support that characterized the attacking force. As Elena finished treating the initial casualties and prepared for additional wounded soldiers who would inevitably follow, she reflected on the tactical situation developing around Forward Operating Base Sentinel. The insurgent assault demonstrated capabilities that would test every aspect of base defensive preparations, including medical support that might require capabilities significantly beyond standard combat medic training. The radio communications from perimeter positions indicated that insurgent forces were maintaining sustained pressure against multiple defensive positions, while demonstrating tactical patience that suggested they were prepared for extended operations rather than quick strike missions. The tactical approach indicated professional military thinking that would create challenges for conventional defensive responses. Elena understood that the developing battle would likely require her to reveal capabilities that she had concealed for 8 months, as the tactical situation might demand advanced medical skills and combat experience that exceeded standard combat medic qualifications. The prospect was both intimidating and liberating, offering the possibility of finally utilizing her full capabilities in service of soldiers who needed every advantage available. Lieutenant Colonel Santos entered the command post at Forward Operating Base Sentinel with the measured urgency that characterized experienced military officers responding to crisis situations that required immediate decisions without panic or confusion. The command post buzzed with controlled activity as personnel coordinated defensive responses, assessed damage from the initial mortar attack, and attempted to establish communication with higher headquarters through systems that had been partially compromised by the bombardment. Santos reviewed tactical displays that showed insurgent positions around the base perimeter, force estimates based on observed fire patterns, and defensive capability assessments that painted a concerning picture of Forward Operating Base Sentinels' ability to repel sustained assault. The intelligence picture indicated that the base faced coordinated attack from approximately 60 insurgents, using tactics and equipment that exceeded previous threat assessments for the region. Staff Sergeant Torres presented his assessment of defensive positions and personnel readiness, REPORTIN-G, that the initial mortar attack had caused minimal casualties, but significant damage to communication equipment and vehicle assets that would impact the base's ability to coordinate defensive operations and request external support. Torres was competent and professional, but his tactical assessment reflected conventional military thinking that might prove inadequate against unconventional assault tactics. The tactical briefing revealed that insurgent forces had established blocking positions on all major access routes to Forward Operating Base Sentinel, effectively isolating the base from external reinforcement while preparing for sustained assault operations. The isolation meant that the base would need to rely entirely on internal resources to repel the attack, placing enormous pressure on limited personnel and equipment. Santos questioned Torres about offensive capabilities available for disrupting insurgent positions before they could complete preparation for major assault operations. The discussion revealed that Forward Operating Base Sentinel possessed limited offensive assets, with most heavy weapons positioned for defensive operations, rather than offensive strikes against targets beyond the immediate perimeter. The conversation between Santos and Torres focused on conventional military responses to insurgent assault, including coordinated defensive fire, tactical movement to reinforce threatened positions, and communication with higher command elements that might provide artillery support or airstrikes against insurgent positions. The planning was competent but reflected traditional approaches that might prove inadequate against sophisticated tactics. Corporal Mitchell entered the command post with reports from perimeter observation posts that provided additional detail about insurgent capabilities and tactical approaches. Mitchell's reports indicated that attacking forces were using professional, Military tactics including coordinated fire and movement, tactical communication, and systematic approaches to base reconnaissance that suggested extensive training and preparation. The intelligence provided by Mitchell painted a picture of insurgent forces that possessed capabilities significantly exceeding local threat assessments, including weapon systems that could penetrate base defensive positions and tactical coordination that enabled complex assault operations. The revelation forced Santos to reconsider defensive plans that had been based on less sophisticated threat assumptions. Santos attempted to establish communication with higher command elements that could provide reinforcement or fire support. But the communication systems damaged during the initial mortar attack were providing only intermittent contact with external facilities. The communication problems meant that Forward Operating Base Sentinel would need to rely on internal resources for an extended period before external support became available. The tactical situation briefing concluded with Santos assigning defensive responsibilities to available personnel, but the assignments reflected conventional thinking about combat roles that placed support personnel in secondary positions rather than integrating all available capabilities into defensive operations. The approach was standard, but potentially wasteful of resources that might prove critical during sustained combat. Private Chun reported to the command post with intelligence about insurgent assault preparations observed from his perimeter observation post, describing tactical movements that suggested imminent escalation from harassment to direct assault operations. Chun's reports indicated that insurgent forces were completing preparation for coordinated attacks against multiple base positions simultaneously. Santos received Chun's intelligence with professional attention but appeared overwhelmed by the scope and sophistication of the threat facing Forward Operating Base Sentinel. The tactical challenge exceeded the base commander's previous experience with insurgent operations, requiring responses to threats that had not been anticipated during defensive planning and preparation. The command post discussion revealed that conventional defensive preparations were proving inadequate for the threat level that Forward Operating Base Sentinel actually faced, forcing improvised responses that utilized available resources in ways that had not been rehearsed or planned. Santos was making reasonable decisions under difficult circumstances, but the tactical situation exceeded established contingency plans. Santos attempted to coordinate with adjacent military units that might provide mutual support during sustained combat operations, but communication problems and tactical situation assessments indicated that other facilities were facing similar threats and would be unable to provide assistance for the foreseeable future. The revelation meant that Forward Operating Base Sentinel would face the assault with only internal resources. Torres presented proposals for aggressive defensive actions that would disrupt insurgent assault preparations, but Santos rejected the recommendations based on concerns about exposing limited personnel to risks that might compromise overall defensive capabilities. The decision reflected prudent resource management, but potentially sacrificed opportunities to influence the tactical situation before insurgent forces completed their preparation. The tactical discussion in the command post revealed fundamental limitations in conventional military thinking about insurgent threats and appropriate responses to sophisticated assault tactics. Santos and his subordinates were competent within their experience base, but the tactical situation exceeded their previous exposure to complex combat scenarios. Mitchell reported additional intelligence about insurgent weapons capabilities, including observations of heavy weapons that could penetrate base defensive positions and threaten critical facilities, including the medical aid station. The weapons assessment forced reconsideration of evacuation plans and medical treatment procedures that had assumed relative safety for non-combat personnel. Santos reviewed available personnel assets and discovered that Forward Operating Base Sentinel had limited reserves available for reinforcing threatened positions or responding to tactical developments that required rapid deployment of additional forces. The personnel limitations meant that defensive operations would need to rely on fixed positions rather than tactical flexibility. The command post briefing concluded with Santos implementing defensive measures that were appropriate for CONVENTIONAL threats, but potentially inadequate for the sophisticated assault that Forward Operating Base Sentinel actually faced. The defensive plan reflected standard military doctrine applied to non-standard tactical situations, creating mismatches between available responses and actual requirements. Torres departed the command post with assignments for coordinating perimeter defense, but his tactical approach remained focused on conventional infantry operations rather than integrated defense that utilized all available capabilities, including support personnel who might possess relevant skills. The conventional thinking reflected institutional biases that could prove costly during unconventional combat. Santos attempted to establish contingency plans for various tactical scenarios that might develop during sustained combat, but the planning process revealed gaps between theoretical preparation and practical requirements for responding to sophisticated insurgent assault tactics. The contingency planning was systematic, but potentially incomplete for actual combat requirements. The final element of command post preparation was Santos attempting to coordinate medical support for anticipated casualties, but the discussion revealed limited understanding of medical capabilities and procedures that would be required during sustained combat operations. Santos viewed medical support as routine logistics rather than tactical capability that might influence combat effectiveness. Elena Martinez observed the command post activities from her position in the medical aid station, recognizing through her special forces experience that conventional defensive planning was potentially inadequate for the sophisticated threat that Forward Operating Base Sentinel actually faced. The tactical situation would likely require capabilities and responses that exceeded standard military preparation and institutional thinking. The developing crisis at Forward Operating Base Sentinel was revealing the limitations of conventional military organization and thinking when confronted with unconventional threats that required innovative responses and utilization of all available capabilities regardless of official assignments and institutional prejudices. The coming combat would test whether adaptability could overcome institutional limitations when survival was at stake. The tactical situation at Forward Operating Base Sentinel deteriorated rapidly as insurgent forces completed their preparation for coordinated assault operations, transitioning from harassment and reconnaissance to sustained offensive action. That would test every aspect of the base's defensive capabilities. Elena Martinez monitored the developing crisis from the medical aid station, while treating wounded soldiers who arrived with increasing frequency as the insurgent pressure intensified. Around the perimeter positions, the latest casualty report painted a sobering picture of the base's defensive situation, with multiple soldiers wounded during insurgent probing attacks and several observation posts reporting ammunition shortages that would compromise their ability to maintain effective defensive fire during sustained assault. Elena treated shrapnel wounds, concussion injuries, and stress reactions while listening to radio communications that revealed the mounting pressure on defensive positions. Staff Sergeant Torres appeared in the medical aid station doorway, his combat equipment showing signs of recent engagement and his expression reflecting the strain of coordinating defensive operations under increasingly difficult circumstances. Torres was competent and dedicated, but Elena could see that the tactical situation was exceeding his experience with conventional military operations and standard infantry tactics. Torres briefed Elena about the latest tactical developments. With professional efficiency, despite obvious fatigue and stress from hours of sustained combat operations, the insurgent forces had established fire superiority over several perimeter positions and were preparing for coordinated assault that would likely overwhelm defensive capabilities, unless additional resources could be deployed to reinforce threatened Positions. The briefing revealed that Forward Operating Base Sentinel faced imminent assault from multiple directions simultaneously, with insurgent forces demonstrating tactical coordination and weapons capabilities that exceeded defensive planning. Assumptions. Torres explained that base leadership was implementing contingency plans that included consolidating defensive positions and preparing for sustained siege operations. Elena absorbed the tactical information while continuing medical treatment. For wounded soldiers, her special forces background allowing her to understand implications that exceeded the details Torres was able to provide. The tactical situation matched scenarios she had encountered during unconventional warfare operations. Complex combat environments that required innovative responses rather than standard military procedures. Torres concluded his briefing by explaining that casualty levels were expected to increase dramatically during the anticipated assault, requiring medical support that might exceed standard combat medic capabilities. The warning was delivered professionally but carried undertones suggesting doubt about Elena's ability to handle complex trauma cases under sustained fire from determined attackers. Elena provided standard acknowledgement of Torres's briefing, while internally recognizing that the tactical situation would likely require capabilities that significantly exceeded her official qualifications as combat medic. The moment of decision was approaching when her concealed background would either remain hidden or be revealed through circumstances that demanded utilization of her actual training and experience. Torres departed the medical aid station to coordinate additional defensive preparations, but his parting comments revealed continued assumptions about medical capabilities and Elena's role during sustained combat operations. The institutional prejudices that had characterized their previous interactions remained intact despite the desperate tactical situation facing Forward Operating Base Sentinel. Elena completed treatment of the wounded soldiers while monitoring radio communications that provided increasing detail about insurgent assault preparations and defensive countermeasures. The tactical picture indicated that conventional defensive approaches were proving inadequate against sophisticated assault tactics that utilized professional military training and coordination. The radio traffic revealed that perimeter observation posts were reporting coordinated insurgent movement toward assault positions, indicating that the major attack would commence within the next hour and would involve simultaneous pressure against multiple defensive positions. The tactical intelligence suggested that Forward Operating Base Sentinel would face its greatest tests since establishment. Elena organized medical supplies for mass casualty treatment, while considering the tactical implications of the developing assault and the likelihood that conventional defensive measures would prove inadequate against professional insurgent tactics. Her Special Forces experience suggested that innovative responses would be necessary to prevent the base from being overrun by numerically superior and tactically sophisticated attackers. The first indication that Elena's medical support role would expand beyond standard combat medic duties came when Specialist Rodriguez arrived at the medical aid station with 4 critically wounded soldiers who had been evacuated from overrun perimeter positions. The casualties included complex trauma cases that would challenge fully equipped hospital emergency rooms, requiring immediate surgical intervention to prevent death from blood loss and organ damage. Rodriguez briefed Elena about the tactical situation at the perimeter positions, explaining that insurgent assault forces had achieved local superiority and were advancing systematically toward the main base facilities. The defensive positions were being abandoned under overwhelming pressure, forcing consolidation into secondary positions that would bring combat operations closer to critical support facilities, including the medical aid station. Elena assessed the wounded soldiers with professional efficiency, immediately recognizing that their survival required surgical intervention that exceeded standard combat medic capabilities and equipment. The injuries included penetrating abdominal trauma, complex limb fractures with arterial damage, sucking chest wounds, and traumatic brain injury that demanded immediate advanced medical treatment. The tactical situation described by Rodriguez indicated that medical evacuation would be impossible for the foreseeable future, placing complete responsibility for treating critically wounded soldiers on Elena's capabilities and available resources. The wounded soldiers would die without surgical intervention that officially exceeded her qualifications and authority as combat medic assigned to Forward Operating Base Sentinel. Elena made her decision in the span of seconds that separated routine medical support from life-or-death surgical intervention under combat conditions. The wounded soldiers required capabilities that she possessed but had concealed for 8 months. Advanced trauma surgery skills that could save lives if she was willing to reveal training that exceeded her official assignment. Rodriguez observed Elena's initial assessment of the wounded soldiers and recognized immediately that their injuries exceeded routine medical support capabilities, requiring surgical intervention that would normally be provided by military physicians at advanced medical facilities. Rodriguez's expression reflected understanding that the tactical situation had created medical requirements that exceeded available resources and standard procedures. Elena began emergency surgical procedures using advanced trauma techniques that demonstrated capabilities significantly beyond standard combat medic training, her movements reflecting years of specialized medical education and combat experience that had been concealed beneath routine medical support activities. The surgical intervention was immediate and decisive, prioritizing life-threatening injuries that required instant attention. Rodriguez assisted Elena's surgical procedures with growing amazement as she demonstrated advanced medical capabilities that contradicted every assumption about her qualifications and background. Elena performed emergency surgery with professional competence that reflected extensive training and experience, utilizing techniques that Rodriguez had only observed during medical evacuation to advanced hospitals. Elena's surgical intervention included emergency thoracotomy to repair penetrating chest wounds, vascular surgery to control arterial bleeding from complex limb trauma, emergency craniotomy to relieve intracranial pressure from traumatic brain injury, and abdominal surgery to repair organ damage from shrapnel wounds. The procedures required surgical skills that exceeded most civilian emergency physicians. The surgical procedures were performed using improvised equipment and limited supplies available at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, requiring innovative techniques and creative problem-solving that demonstrated Elena's ability to adapt advanced medical training to resource-constrained environments. The improvisation reflected Special Forces medical training that emphasized flexibility and innovation under adverse conditions. Rodriguez provided surgical assistance while observing Elena's techniques with growing respect and amazement, recognizing professional medical capabilities that contradicted every assumption about combat medic qualifications and training requirements. The surgical competence demonstrated expertise that exceeded Rodriguez's previous exposure to military medical support at any level. Elena completed emergency surgical stabilization of all 4 critically wounded soldiers within 90 minutes, utilizing advanced trauma techniques that had saved lives under similar circumstances during Special Forces operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. The surgical intervention demonstrated capabilities that would have been impossible without years of specialized medical training and extensive combat experience. The wounded soldier's vital signs stabilized following Elena's surgical intervention, confirming that her advanced medical capabilities had prevented deaths that would have been inevitable without immediate surgical treatment. The successful trauma surgery under improvised conditions demonstrated medical expertise that exceeded anything available at Forward Operating Base Sentinel through official channels. Rodriguez's assistance during the surgical procedures had provided him with detailed observation of Elena's medical capabilities, creating a witness to advanced skills that could no longer be concealed or dismissed as routine combat medic competence. The revelation would inevitably spread through the base, ending Elena's 8 months of concealed qualifications and hidden expertise. Elena's emergency surgical intervention had been necessitated by tactical circumstances that exceeded conventional medical support capabilities, forcing revelation of advanced training that she had concealed to avoid questions about her background and current assignment. The life-or-death medical requirements had made concealment impossible, while providing justification for utilizing capabilities that exceeded official authorization. The tactical situation continued deteriorating around Forward Operating Base Sentinel as insurgent forces pressed their coordinated assault against consolidated defensive positions. But Elena's medical intervention had demonstrated capabilities that would prove increasingly relevant as combat operations intensified and additional casualties required advanced trauma treatment that exceeded standard military medical support. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.